Here is a question that almost nobody in official Washington wants to answer honestly. How does a country under the most comprehensive economic sanctions in modern history, cut off from SWIFT, cut off from Western insurance markets, cut off from Western insurance markets, cut off from international shipping registers, managed to export more than 1.5 million barrels of oil every single day? And how does it do that through one of the most heavily monitored maritime corridors on Earth? While Washington publicly claims that corridor is either closed, destructed, or too dangerous for normal commercial traffic, the answer isn't missiles. It isn't warships. It isn't some exotic new weapon. The answer is architecture, a carefully constructed parallel system involving hundreds of tankers, a network of offshore brokers, mid-ocean ship-to-ship transfers, disabled tracking transponders, and a single dominant buyer who absorbs nearly the entire flow. That has now become, in the words of maritime intelligence analysts, not an emergency workaround, but a fully institutionalized alternative supply chain. Iran's shadow fleet has matured, sustaining exports of between 1.3 and 1.6 million barrels per day, despite UN snapback sanctions with faster and more efficient ship-to-ship operations to China. Army recognition: the Strait of Hormuz never had to close for Iran to win this dimension of the energy war. It only had to become conditional, available to some, inaccessible in practical terms to others. Ray McGovern has spent decades warning that America's most consequential defeats happen not on battlefields, but in the assumptions its analysts refuse to question. This is one of those moments. Pause, let it breathe. To understand how this system works, you need to understand what sanctions were actually designed to do and why, in McGovern's analytical framework, they so often produce the opposite of their intended result. Having spent 27 years at the CIA, including chairing the production of national intelligence estimates and delivering the president's daily brief to multiple administrations, McGovern developed a consistent and documented skepticism toward the use of economic coercion as a substitute for diplomacy. He has argued repeatedly across interviews and public commentary spanning decades that sanctions regimes tend to harden the resolve of their targets, drive them toward alternative alliances, and ultimately accelerate the very strategic real immense Washington claims to be preventing. The Iran China oil relationship is, in his framework, a textbook case. When the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions, it did not eliminate Iran's need to sell oil. It eliminated Iran's access to Western buyers, Western shipping, and Western finance. What filled that vacuum was not Iranian capitulation, it was Beijing. After Western sanctions cut Tehran off from many international buyers and global financial systems, Iran found a willing buyer in China, the world's largest crude importer, which now absorbs around 90% of Iran's oil exports. The Times of Israel, that single strategic fact, is the foundation of everything that follows, and it raises the central question McGovern has consistently posed about American foreign policy. When a strategy produces the opposite of its stated goal, who is actually winning? The conventional narrative about the Strait of Hormuz frames it as a binary open or close. That framing, McGovern's analytical tradition would argue, is exactly wrong and strategically dangerous in its wrongness. What the documentary and satellite record of 2024 and 24 and 25 reveals is something more sophisticated. The strait did not close. It became filtered for commercial tankers operating under Western flags, carrying Western market insurance, Tracked by Western-linked AIS monitoring systems, the risk calculus in the region shifted dramatically. Lloyd's of London war risk premiums surged. Major shipping companies rerouted or paused. The perception of closure became, in practical terms, functionally equivalent to actual closure for those players. For Iranian flagged and Iranian linked vessels operating under a completely different set of rules, the passage continued. At the center of Iran's sanctions evasion strategy is what industry analysts call the dark fleet, a network of vessels that operates outside normal shipping channels and tracking systems, employing ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, AIS transponder deactivation, regular flag switching, and the blending and relabeling of crude to disguise its origin. The war zone, this is not improvisation. What began as improvised workarounds are now repeatable supply chains connecting sanctioned oil to Chinese refiners, a functional parallel system, not an emergency patch. Army recognition, the scale is documented and unambiguous. Iran exported approximately 587 million barrels in 2024, with China accounting for 91% of those imports. Military Watch magazine in 2025, despite the reimposition of UN snapback sanctions in September and the dramatically escalated U.S. maximum pressure campaign, export volumes stood at around 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day, up slightly from the previous year and a full 25% above 2023 levels. Wikipedia, in McGovern's framework, this is precisely what happens when policymakers confuse the performance of pressure with the substance of strategy. So, who is buying all of this oil, and how has Beijing maintained its ability to do so while publicly presenting itself as a neutral actor? The answer lies in what analysts have come to call the teapot refinery network. Wary of sanctions exposure, China's major state-owned refineries stepped back from buying Iranian crude after the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. The gap was filled by small independent refineries clustered in Shandong province, named teapots for their modest scale, which by 2025 accounted for an estimated 90% of Iran's oil exports to China. The Times of Israel, the setup, analysts note, gives Beijing a degree of what one Atlantic Council researcher described as plausible deniability. The smaller refiners pose limited systemic risk if individually sanctioned, but the picture beneath that surface is considerably more complex. Current research shows that the teapot's independent label doesn't capture the full underlying reality. Beneath their private ownership structures, the refineries connect closely to the Chinese state through joint ventures, partnerships with state-owned enterprises, and government procurement arrangements. The Times of Israel, this layered architecture, private face state infrastructure is precisely what McGovern's analytical framework would predict from a power that has studied American sanctions enforcement carefully and built its response accordingly. As one researcher put it, China has built a sanctions AVA's economy. The shadow system wouldn't exist if Beijing and Tehran hadn't made a strategic decision to allow it from oil to finance. The Times of Israel Washington has responded with escalating designations. Between December 2024 and April 2025 alone, OFAC sanctioned a total of 86 individuals and entities in more than 25 countries and identified 85 tankers as blocked property. NPR, the Treasury Department, has targeted brokers in the UAE and Hong Kong, tanker operators in India and China, and vessels registered across Panama, Barbados, and the Cook Islands. And yet the barrels keep moving. McGovern has long argued, drawing on his intelligence career, that this kind of enforcement theater in which the measures are real but the strategic outcome is unchanged, reflects a deeper institutional failure. The refusal to ask whether the underlying policy is producing the intended result. There is one further dimension to this story that mainstream coverage consistently underweights, and that sits at the very center of McGovern's broader concern about American strategic overextension. Renan's oil exports to China are not denominated in dollars. This is not a footnote. It is the mechanism by which the entire system insulates itself from American financial leverage. Iranian petroleum is reportedly sold below prevailing market prices to entice foreign traders, the Jerusalem Post, but the discount is settled in currencies and through channels that sit entirely outside the US. Dash controlled financial architecture, past administrations have implicitly tolerated significant sanction flows, especially to China, to avoid sparking a trade war. Army recognition that implicit tolerance has given the parallel system years to mature, institutionalize, and become, in the assessment of maritime intelligence firm Vortexa, uh, essentially irreversible in the short term. McGovern's documented concern about dollar weaponization is directly relevant here. He has argued publicly that the aggressive use of financial sanctions accelerates the very de-dollarization trends that American strategists fear most. That every time Washington uses